Okay, good morning and welcome to our Erev Shabbat Perashat class, Perashat Haye Sara. The question today is, how would you frame Abraham Avinu after the entire history presented to us in the last three parashiyot? More specifically, let me ask you this. If you were to choose a description or a statement of Abraham that best fits him, learning Parashat Lech Lecha, Vayera and Haye Sara, this week's parasha, which of the Pesukim, the descriptions, would be on your top three to depict Abraham Avinu and not only depict his character and his accomplishments, but is it possible even to pick a pasuk from every parasha which shows the progression of his greatness in every parasha? So obviously, there's many different options and approaches. I came up with the following. Parashat Lech Lecha, Parashat Vayera, Parashat Haye Sara, one description, event, or action that describes something about this great man and this Renaissance man and his achievements, but also shows a progression of maturity and accomplishments and impact on the world. Parashat Lech Lecha. I choose three words. After God commands him to leave his land, he comes to Eretz Yisrael and he finds a place, he builds an altar, and it says, Vayikra b'shem Adonai. And he called on the name of God. And we know from the commentaries, we know from the Ramban, and Moreh Nebuchim, etc., that phrase, which is actually repeated exactly and in different forms throughout the next two parashiyot, describes a scene, describes an exercise in which Abraham engaged, you can say, from that point on throughout the course of his life. Calling in the name of God doesn't just mean praying. Calling in the name of God is a term which implies education. Abraham Avinu picking a public area, perhaps a stage, making a sermon, slowly also on an individual basis, one by one, recruiting people, preaching about monotheism, reintroducing the idea of a God in this world, a primal and all-controlling and creating God, inspiring people and bringing them under the wings of that God, building educational institutions in the hundreds and thousands, and perhaps, as the Rambam says, tens of thousands. And then, after accomplishing that in one location, picking up, establishing, picking up, moving on, and once again, reestablishing in another location. And that Vayikra b'shem Hashem exercise was the mission of his life. He made that the absolute objective of his existence, and that is to teach and publicize the name of God and the values of God and a godly life to all the inhabitants on earth. Not much, just to save the world. And that is Abraham Avinu's, you can say, job description that he took upon himself. And those three words, Vayikra b'shem Hashem, that we see in the beginning of Parashat Lech Lecha. How do you beat that? Parashat Vayera, the pasuk that I choose is the one in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu sort of introduced Abraham prior to giving him the opportunity to pray for Sodom and Amorah. And that he revealed to us what he needs to reveal to Abraham his plans. And he gave us a pasuk, which is a timeless pasuk. It's an incredible pasuk. And he says, I know Abraham, I love him, I embrace him, and I know that I recognize that this is what he's all about. And in that pasuk, it says, V'shameru, he'll teach his children and generations to come, V'shameru derech Adonai la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat. And that is to observe, quote unquote, the ways of God, which is, namely, to act in the manner of and to practice and to perpetrate tzedakah u'mishpat, righteousness and justice. Last year, we gave a class understanding in context as to what that meant as the preface to the prayer of Sodom Va'amorah and the actions that Hashem took out afterwards on Sodom Va'amorah. But just in a vacuum, to look at that phrase, we know from the Midrash that tells us first tzedakah, then mishpat, that the approach of the Jew in general, to any mizvot and fulfilling any obligation should always be doing it first and foremost out of a feeling of innate goodwill and love of God and love of people, tzedakah. But then if you're not ready for that, that's not you're not mature enough for that approach, then mishpat, or if someone isn't, then you guide them in the way of mishpat. Do it because it's the letter of the law. It's the right thing to do. You should do it. And that was Abraham Avinu's approach to people that he taught, to people that he took in his estate. First, tzedakah, right? The famous the anecdote with people coming to his little motel as they pass by, gives them food, say baracha, rohi, bless. What's bless? What does that mean? Yeah, this food didn't come from nowhere. Bless the God that gave this to you, that provides for you. Taught to people, gave them the opportunity out of a sense of reasoning, of goodwill, of appreciation. And then if not, he said, you know what, you're not going to make the blessing. Is pay me $5 and just say it and be on your way. That's mishpat, right? So that idea, that idea of believing in man's kind's innate ability of goodwill, first and foremost, before following the letter of the law, is the approach that we have to everything that we do in observance. That was Abraham Avinu's approach to people. He believes in people. First tzedakah, then mishpat. And we see this idea, by the way, God is the king who rules with the synthesis of those two ingredients. As we know, judgment is necessary. Truth is necessary. Accountability. God's mannerisms is built on perfect justice. And yet, he still judges us with a dose of compassion and righteousness. Melech ohev tzedakah mishpat. We say in the Berachah every day. And that is a way of being that we see basically describes Am Yisrael's as a nation and their attitude towards observance of God. As we see in the pinnacle of our existence in the times of David HaMelech, it says that he was ruling the land, David was, in his kingdom in a manner of tzedakah and mishpat. And Yeshaya, the prophet, speaks about the future redemption and Geulah, and says, Sion b'mishpat tepadeh v'shabeha b'staka, Perek Aleph Yeshaya, that Jerusalem will only be redeemed in tzedakah and mishpat. So we see this as the principle, the founding father established for us, the practice of the greatest king and the pinnacle of our existence, and the future, the motivation for and the status of the future redemption of Am Yisrael. So that is Abraham Avinu, not just practicing and preaching in terms of publicizing the name of God, but the way he learned how to interact with people, the next level. But the pasuk that I chose to depict Abraham Avinu from Perashat Haye Sara, it's a dark horse. It's an underrated one that is going to show his further progression, is the first pasuk in Perek Kaf Dalet, pasuk Aleph, where he's about to summons Eliezer, go find a wife. The pasuk Torah introduces Abraham by saying, "Abraham zaken ba bayamim, v'Adonai berach et Abraham bako." Seems like a very benign pasuk. Abraham was an older man, coming in days, getting older, and God blessed him with everything. And yet, if we sensitive to the nuances of this pasuk, we see, first of all, certainly there's a repetitious phrase. He's zaken, he's elderly. So then why add on the description of ba bayamim? Right? He's coming in days. It's repetitious. And then, of course, the ending of the pasuk is very ambiguous. What is that supposed to mean? He blessed them bakol with everything. I fill in the blank. That can mean anything, right? Now, what kind of blessing are we to strive for? It doesn't really specify. There's no elaboration. So let's look at those two curious terminologies in that pasuk. Try to open it up and see what the Torah is really describing at the end of his life. about Abraham Avinu than perhaps maybe his greatest accomplishment. So in terms of this Ba Bayamim, interesting terminology, coming in days. Kliyakad is a revolutionary general comment. He says, you know what? In a person's life, Yamim, days, and Laila can represent two different types of people. A person whose most of his life is material, pursuing his wealth, his possessions, etc., and indulging in physical indulgence. The early days of his life are Yamim. They're light. That's his accomplishments because he's stronger. He's able to physically indulge. He's able to amass wealth, right? But then as he gets older, right, he doesn't have the same physical strength. He can no longer accomplish what he looked at to be life's pursuits. And those are days of darkness for him. And he just waits to deteriorate and have less strength. And all of that, what he considered to be accomplishments in life, are no longer. That is one approach to life. But someone whose focus in life is intellect, is education, is knowledge, is spirituality, is character, the intangible, is a person who in the beginning, his life is the lelot, because he's building himself, he's discovering, he's growing. And as he grows and proceeds and gets older, his life are yamim, because that person is first starting to ripen as he gets older. He's first starting to cultivate himself. He's growing so that when he reaches this older age, he's actually at his peak. He's most productive point. He's able to give more. He's able to understand more. He grows more because his intellect, his education, his knowledge, and his relationship to Hashem is greater. And so says the Kliyaka, the description of Abraham Avinu is that Ba towards is approaching Yamim, meant he was reaching the most productive phase of his life when he was Zaken. Not sitting in an old age home. People physically have no choice sometimes, but he wasn't just sitting around playing cards. He was Baba Yamim. He was rolling as an elderly man in his 160s and 170s. Rabbi Hirsch takes that word Zaken. We know standing for an elderly seban zaken. Gemara tells us is not an elderly, but the root word kinyan, to acquire, is in that context. It meant a tamid hakam you should stand for. So Rabbi Hirsch takes that and he says, when you look at the word zaken, it's a description not just of an elderly person, a person who's acquired. And if that's described in terms of the person's life, so that's describing a person's acquisition in this world of two worlds. In this very world, to be able to acquire this world and the next world. And he says in Abraham Avinu that he took his stamp of godliness and it impressed it upon an earthly life. And that's really our jobs in this world, to take our soul and impress it upon our body. And somehow slowly grow out of our earthliness and realize the potential of our godliness. Abraham was Zaken, he acquired, he was able to pull that off in this world. In that context, he says, you know what Ba Bayamim means? It means that Ba is Lashon Hoveh, present tense. He's coming with days. He's like a freight train. He doesn't see an end to life. His attitude was a constant, it was like an open road. Here I come. Where am I coming to? I'm coming to my destiny. My destination is the future world, is Olam Haba, is what God really has in store for me, what he really created for me. And therefore, everything he did in Olam Hazeh is perspective. It's a broad perspective of the big picture in life. He was Ba Bayamim. His days was a march. And every day of his life was another milestone marking the progress as he gets to the ultimate goal, to his final destination. He was coming in days and moving and progressing and reaching a final goal which is beyond this world, that broad perspective. And finally, let's look at that word bakol. The word bakol, first of all, it's fascinating Gemara, it's an argument about Bakol meaning he has a son or he had a daughter, didn't have a daughter. What does that mean? It's a whole discussion in and of itself. But if you look at some of the Midrashim and the Mefarshim, you see that this word really describes some of the highlights of different aspects of Abraham. There's a Midrash that says that Bakol and everything means he really was able to master himself, master his evil inclinations, yes, hara, and was a whole person. The Aimek Tavad really beautifully says that Bakol is referring not to himself, but his interaction with other people, with everyone. In other words, Hashem blessed him to be a person that has the ability to guide everyone, impact every person that he interacted with and crossed his path, that he was such a productive person with everyone. And that is that he was busy his whole life, providing for people, guiding people. And as he got older, that really came to fruition because he was more understanding and more mature and more wise and more insightful. How many people are he affected by the end of his life? That's Bakol with everyone. Of course, you have this beautiful idea. Bakol means that he had this contentedness, right? I have everything at any given moment. And that, of course, the rich man is really one who's always content. He always believed that he had everything. So you take this pasuk and put it together, right? The idea of Zaken and Baba Yamin and Bakol. This pasuk really describes the most accomplished person possible. He took all his life's ventures and his objectives and his mission of teaching and preaching God. And of course, the way he saw and approached people, so that Kal Mishpat, and he built that up to an apex where by the end of his life, he was this man who was honed, who was complete, who had incredible perspective on life, who knew where he was going, who had a broad picture, and who was, by the end of his life, really at a point that you can't even see a man accomplishing more, really Bakol. And Bakol in his personal relationship to God and the way he impacted others and his attitude in life and really a life of accomplishment par excellence, the paradigm for all individual Jews, for all of the future. So I look at this pasuk in Perashat Haye Sara, in my third choice in consecutive parashiot, but the one that really progresses over the other two and wraps up this incredible accomplished life of Abraham Avinu, from which we all should and will learn Be'ezat Hashem. Shabbat Shalom.